So the Liberals released their full election platform today, and the plan is a mix of old and new proposals, including $78 billion in new spending. The Liberals would pay for part of that by introducing tax measures geared at corporations and the wealthy. Sahir Khan is the Executive Vice President of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. That group reviews platforms from political parties to see if they actually make fiscal sense and are affordable. Doesn't endorse or comment on the merits of the platform itself, though. Sahir Khan's in Ottawa. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, David.
Okay, so the Liberal platform promises $78 billion in new spending, about $25 billion in new revenue from tax increases to corporations and the wealthy. What do you make of that ratio? It is, it doesn't appear to be a track to ending the deficit.
Well, I think one of the challenges, David, is that sometimes we look at ending the deficit as an end in of itself. I think what we're really trying to target is sustainable public finances, at the federal level as well as other orders of government. So I think we've created this kind of mythical beast of this balanced budget that everyone's kind of pursuing. But the reality is we want to make sure that we can afford the programs at each order of government that citizens really expect, and that those are sustainable, that we're not going to be overwhelmed by interest charges. We're not going to pass on huge amounts of debt to the next generation, and that we can kind of sustain a standard of living. So, we look at this and go, is it sustainable? Is there prudence here? And that ends up being much more important criteria than simply, are we pursuing a balanced budget?
Talk to me just about inflation and what that ultimately means for Canadians.
Well, I think inflation's become a political issue during the election, and the reality is there have been a few factors associated with COVID and supply constraints that have driven a few commodities a little higher. Our expectation is this is going to settle down over time, and things will, supply will catch up with demand, and it'll be less of an issue. What are legitimate issues are poverty and housing, which I think are legitimate issues for political discussion during the election. I think inflation's become a bit of a boogeyman that, based on what we think is to be a relatively short-term blip.
Okay, I just want to explore that a little bit because, as you know, inflation has become something of an issue over the course of this campaign. You're saying you think it's a blip. You think it will sort of subside and get under control. But what is causing it? You talked about supply lines. Is it a short-term cause?
Yeah, I think there's a short-term cause. I think if you look at some of the impact from COVID and constraints in supply chains as economies kind of restart, you see certain cost categories, you see inflation and you see volatility, but our expectation is that much of this is going to slow down or settle down over time. We're about a half point above the Bank of Canada's inflation target of 1 to 3%. And our sense is it's not really worth getting excited about, particularly in the course of the campaign. But the point we made in a recent publication is that there are issues around affordability, around housing and poverty that are actually legitimate issues to be discussed on the campaign trail, and probably don't get the airtime that inflation's been getting, which we think is a bit of a distraction.
Okay, I don't want to beat this one to death, but just very quickly, because again, this has been an issue, and I know you want to stay nonpartisan, so I will try to ask the question this way: is the Bank of Canada a cause at all of the inflation we're experiencing?
That's not our view.
Okay. Let's turn back to the Liberal platform, which, despite the increase to the deficit, the Liberals' fiscal plan, you say, remains sustainable over the long term. How is that? How so?
Well, essentially over the long term, as long as economic growth is marching along just a little higher than the expenditures of the federal government, that gap is going to close, and you'll get a declining debt to GDP over time, and eventually you'll get to something that approaches a balanced budget, whether it's a worthwhile pursuit or not. So the reality is that unless you're baking in a lot of kind of permanent spending that you can't unwind, you're heading towards stable public finances at the federal level, under a range of scenarios, and the Liberals have presented one way to do it. They are using available room that has been created by the PBO baseline forecast, or I won't say created, but observed by the PBO baseline forecast from budget 2021. And some of that space is being used, and some additional space has been created with revenue measures. But on the whole, these aren't permanent measures that are exceeding the expected growth in the economy. And so we're expecting that the level of debt relative to GDP will continue to decline over time.
And I appreciate the role of the IFSD is not to say that this is a good platform, you should engage in it. Your role is to say, okay, this platform is costed out and does the things fiscally that you would expect. Am I assessing that right? And if so, how do you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, David, I think it's does the narrative, does the money and the measures, does it kind of match up to the narrative that the party's trying to put out there? So is there a reasonable fiscal plan behind it? Now, fiscal plan means, do you have measures that are costed, and ultimately we hope that they're all costed by the PBO? Mm-hmm. Have you put real numbers and real programs behind it? Do you have implementation plans that don't have huge downside fiscal risk to them? So do the numbers really add up? So at the end of the day, does the plan make sense?
Yeah.
Can voters rely on this as a faithful representation of the narrative that a party's putting out during the election?
And you're saying,
and the reality is, it does. And our point is that it's credible. The Liberal Party of Canada is presenting a narrative that is substantiated by the fiscal plan behind it.
Okay, well, you talk about the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Office, which has looked at the Liberal platform. For the most part, there are a couple of things that were slipped in there later, but for the most part, they've looked at it. It is costed, and you've gone at the IFSD and reviewed it and come up with this conclusion that generally it's good and does the kinds of things you're looking for. Will you do this for the other parties?
Of course, David. And in 2019, we did it for all the major federal parties. And, we're continuing the same practice in a nonpartisan way. And maybe just to make a little bit of a distinction between what we do and the PBO does. The PBO costs the individual measures. We kind of take that as face value and kind of say, okay, well, when we add them all up, what does this mean towards the sustainability of federal finances? What kind of risk do we have with these measures? And kind of look at that kind of overall credibility picture. Whereas I think the focus of the PBO is really look at the individual measures and assess their costs. And, to the extent the parties want to do it, they can include that cost as part of their fiscal plan.
And earlier in our discussion, we were talking about the deficit, and you said, it's not an end unto itself. It's not the thing we should be singularly focused on, although certainly some are. The Conservatives say they will balance the budget in 10 years without cuts. Liberal platform doesn't have a target for when they'll actually eliminate the deficit. On the Conservative idea, what do you make of how the two different parties are approaching the federal deficit?
Well, clearly the Conservative Party has set out a target that the budget will be balanced in 10 years. What we haven't seen from them is a fiscal plan that goes out, that kind of accompanies a narrative that they put out. And until we do, it's really hard to assess how they're going to get there. Mm-hmm. The reality is, from what we understand, the Conservative Party are relying on 3% economic growth on a sustained basis, something we really haven't seen for the last 25 to 30 years. So if they're not using the PBO baseline economic and fiscal forecast as the Liberal Party did, then the question we would have is, so what are they doing? Is that forecast reasonable? And if it's driving their revenue expectations over the next 10 years, then that'll probably explain how they think they're getting there. But if that assumption isn't reasonable, David, then you got to ask questions about whether that's a reasonable target, how it's going to be achieved, and whether you'll need a combination of revenue increases or program cuts to meet that target.
Sahir Khan, thank you so much. Always appreciate our conversations.
My pleasure, David.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.